Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to be taking a look at magic systems. Specifically, we're going to be using Brandon Sanderson's framework for magic rules to understand how we can better implement magic systems into our own writing. The first question we need to ask is, what is a magic system? Realistically, a magic system is any sort of system outside of the character's control, physical control, to have an impact on the world around them. This is a very broad understanding of a magic system. Typically, we see it as a supernatural, but in reality, a lot of magic systems could have same applications in science fiction, which you don't have a supernatural aspect to it, but the effect is still the same. Basically, what ends up happening sometimes in certain types of sci-fi systems is that we create a system that allows for problems to be solved. This allows for plot to move forward. We'll go into a little bit later about some of the issues with this type of mindset, but just know that a magic system is not only for fantasy writing. In addition to this, we want to make sure that we're telling a story that has tension in it. And this is something else we're going to go on in a little bit with in the video. But what I wanted to make sure that we understand is that we need to make sure that we're understanding a magic system not just as a fantasy, but rather something that how our whole totality of our story takes place. These are things that can be applied to not just for fantasy, but science fiction and other areas of our world building in how we write our stories. Now, several examples of different types of magic systems can include harder and soft magic systems. Now, some of the ways that we can understand it, and we'll go over again in this a little bit later, but we have several examples of things that we wouldn't necessarily expect to be magic systems that apply directly to the definition I gave earlier. For example, Avatar: The Last Airbender, they use what's called bending. They don't call it necessarily magic, though it is hinted to early on in the first episode. But the magic system that they use requires a certain level of application or input from the users. Particularly when it comes to bending, we're talking about certain types of body movements to create. This is something seen also in different types of animes. For instance, the anime Naruto requires for certain types of magic system hand gestures. In more popular Western fiction, we have the example of Harry Potter. Harry Potter requires that not only are you pronouncing certain words correct, but you're also making the correct movements, as seen in how Hermione demonstrates better ways of casting a charm or a spell. These are some of the things that we keep in mind in when we tell our stories. How does input to our characters affect the story? So for instance, does the certain types of magic systems that we're looking to create have a expectation of playing out movements or words? A lot of different magic systems require words, but there are some that don't require words, where the person's able to cast it. This is something closer to something like telepathy. We see where there's an input from the character that we're involving onto the world around them. So these are some of the ways that we keep in mind in how we tell our stories. And something else we need to keep in mind is that for me, I personally am not a huge fan of writing stories with magic systems. We talk about magic systems, and what can end up sometimes happening is that we create systems that give us a cheap way out. The ultimate goal of a magic system is to enhance the storytelling experience. When we're telling a story, we need to make sure that we are allowing for tension to be built up. If we have a magic system that answers all the problems, then we lose a lot of tension. For example, in the cycle of Aragon, talking about a boy riding the dragon, we have a situation where the writer takes it to the logical conclusion, where the magic system is something to akin to telekinesis, where the main character is powerful enough where he's able to wipe out whole sections of troops by simply cutting off a certain part of the human anatomy. Now, the way that he has to figure out a way of circumventing this is that the enemy has magic systems in place, their own mages, to prevent that from happening. Now, the problem is with this is that if you are able to create the situation, you have to create a bulwark or a prevention against the magic system being too powerful. If your main character is able to create a magic offensive spell that totally obliterates the enemy, what's the point of doing anything? Why have the magic system at all? So often we want to make sure that we are trying to, as writers, take the easy way out. We want to make sure that our characters are moving through and the plot gets happening. But the problem is if we make that plot smooth, it doesn't give our readers the ability to become excited. Now, there's different types of magic systems that we're going to go off later, but I just want to make sure I reiterate this idea that we have different things that we have to consider when we're talking about magic systems. Magic systems is something that we want to address early on in our writing process. Typically, you want to do it in the first draft. At the latest, second draft. As we are telling these stories, if they are integral part of the plot, we need to make sure that we incorporate them earlier rather than later. So let's get into Sanderson's rules. Sanderson's first law of magics. An author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. One of the things that he talks about in the blog post that I will be linking in below is the fact that if your readers don't have an understanding of the magic system, while it can create a semblance of wonder, it can also make it very hard to build tension. This is why situations like Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf doesn't necessarily use his magic all the time to solve problems, but rather it is something that helps pad the story. We are shown somebody where the magic isn't necessarily crucial to the plot. How many times do we see Gandalf, for instance, use his magic to get the job done? One, Tolkien could have easily had Gandalf being able to use levitation magic. Therefore, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for them to travel great distances if Gandalf could just fly Frodo to Mount Doom. So these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind. And what we're going to talk about here is hard versus soft magic. How much does the magic impact the plot versus hard magic? This leaves rooms for those who want to preserve the sense of wonder in their books. I see a continuum, or a scale, measuring how authors use their magic. On one side of the continuum, we have books where the magic is included in order to establish a sense of wonder and give the setting a fantastical feel. Books that focus on this use of magic tend to want to indicate that men are a small part of the eternal mystical workings of the universe. This gives the reader a sense of tension as they are never certain what dangers or wonders the character will encounter. Indeed, the characters themselves never truly know what can happen and what can't. This is what we're talking about when we talk about soft magic. When we talk about how much the magic impacts the story, when we're telling a soft magic system, we are creating a sense of wonder. Now, there's a downside to this, and we'll get into it with the harder magic, but when we create a more fantastical, wonder-based mindset with our magic system, we need to keep this in mind in how much we are relying on it. Inherently, a soft magic system, because we're not creating rules, because we're not creating a structure of that magic system, it makes us tempted to use this magic system to get ourselves out of problems. Sort of a Deus Ex Machina situation. So for instance, if we have a character in the midst of a battle and we don't create a system where we understand how magic is used, all of a sudden you have a wizard pop up with a relief force without any sort of understanding of how that took place or any sort of foreshadowing of this ability. We lose the ability for the characters to be in danger, at least how the readers perceived it. We want to make sure that our readers feel the danger that our characters are in. Now, obviously, it's a character that we are writing, so depending on how we want to write our stories, they are never going to actually be in danger, but we need to create a sense of danger, and having a soft magic without rules while at the same time overusing that soft magic, we reduce the possibility of things not working out. I've seen this in stories that I've watched and read where you're like, well, this is how they could solve this problem, but they don't actually solve this problem this way. This is a way of circumventing that release of tension for the sake of the story. This is something that we need to keep in mind when we're telling our story. When we create scenarios where our characters could play out in a certain way or scenarios could play out in a certain way, we need to make sure that it's consistent with our story. But in addition to that, that we haven't created an out early on that we are simply ignoring. This creates a discontent in our readers because they are expecting things to play out in a certain way. It's almost as if you're making a promises, like I've talked about in previous videos. You're making a promise of things could be playing out this way, but you don't actually play it out this way. This could be good and or bad depending on how you tell your story. On the other side of the continuum, we have hard magic. This is the side where authors explicitly describe the rules of magic. This is done so that the reader can have fun, the feeling like they themselves are part of the magic, and so that the author can show clever twists and turns in the way the magic works. The magic itself is the character, and by showing off its laws and rules, the author is able to provide twists, world building, and characterization. This is what I was talking about earlier when we talk about setting up boundaries to our characters or boundaries to our magic. That's part of what the next rule is, but we want to make sure that we are understanding what the difference is between the soft and hard magic and how different things can play into how we want our readers to experience our books. Granted, these are general guidelines when it comes to how our magic system works. Everything that I talk about on my channel is always about these are some of the ways that can help you write better. This isn't a sure way. This isn't if you do these things that you are going to get the book that you are looking to have. That's not how this works. Every writer has to do their own story, has to tell their own story. If you are writing by the numbers, coloring inside the lines, you are doing nothing more than regurgitating something else. You need to have a level of creativity and expanding what you've already learned to provide these things, because anybody can cut and paste out of different stories and it will not resonate with the readers. You see this so often when it comes to reusing intellectual properties. You have essentially the same stories again and again and again, and it loses its flavor. It loses those things that end up being the good parts that were previously liked, because people want new things. They need to have a subverted expectations for their stories to continue, for them to understand and for them to enjoy it. If they read the same thing again and again and again, they eventually, not everybody, but eventually will become tired of it and find different things to read. This is why it's always important to avoid cliches. That's what a cliche is that when a person reads and rereads and rereads the same thing, or watches it or listens to it, or any number of intaking of storytelling, they get bored with it. And that's why we want to avoid cliches, and we need to make sure that we're trying to be as original in our own stories as possible. Sanderson's second law of magics: limitations over powers. Tension. An excellent magic system limitation will increase tension. Superman fighting an enemy is, honestly, not very tense. Superman fighting an enemy with kryptonite is far more tense. Batman fighting an enemy is not very tense. Batman fighting an enemy who is playing off his inner fears, the current Batman's biggest weakness being his psychological problem, suddenly becomes far more interesting. Limitations gives us tension. Too often I see new authors leaving out excellent opportunities like this. From here, they end up writing bland scenes with magic that happens abstractly in the ways we can't relate to as readers. As I've said before, we want to make sure that we are creating those emotional connections. If we are showing our characters as little more than gods that can go through and wipe out the enemy without sort of expectation or hint of loss, we are creating a disconnect with our readers. Our readers want to feel what our characters are feeling. That is the ultimate goal of writing. We want to have emotions implanted in our readers. If we are not doing that, then we are going to lose our readers. We are not going to be able to create good long-term stories for our readers to enjoy. Our goal for readers is not necessarily to have something that somebody can read, but rather have those emotional connections for our readers to become connected, to become ingrained into the story, so that when we tell our stories that they can feel what we want them to feel. Ultimately, writing is an element of manipulation. We're trying to create emotional responses in our readers. These are things that we keep in mind when we talk about creating tension. Tension is one of those things that is critical, but we don't often talk about it. Tension is required for good stories. If we are creating a scene where the reader doesn't care if they continue on reading, we don't create a scene or create a story where there's a driving force emotionally for them to continue reading, we are going to lose our readers. Cost. The One Ring makes you more covetous and paranoid the longer you hold it. And beyond that, if you use it to turn invisible, the evil powers can sense where you are. These are things that we call costs. Using the magic or being associated with it has a cost. These costs can be more abstract. You go crazy by using the magic. Or more concrete, if you run out of spice, you can no longer travel faster than light in space. The distinction here is how much wiggle room the author has. Cost is one of those things that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to. A lot of animes or light novels from the West, a lot of animes or light novels from, say, Japan, they require some sort of magic points. This is something that we see a lot, is that there is a cost to overusing the magic system. Not every anime or system like that uses magic points, but they have different ways of indicating cost. They talk about how they are unable to do it, unable to perform this task because of reasons. Both are useful for different reasons. Costs are very important to consider. Readers naturally expect there to be a cost, and a lot of times new writers skimp on giving their magic one. However, to be aware that if your cost is too drastic, it can lead to you never being able to use that magic. If casting a spell causes one of your grandparents to die, then you are not just going to be able to see that spell used very often in your book. It's easy to lock yourself in with a cost that can hinder flexibility. This is very true. We want to make sure that we are not adding too much of a burden when it comes to using our magic systems. But this is also a good opportunity if you are being proactive and foreshadowing in your story. If, say, you have a spell that it is a forbidden spell because it requires the sacrifice of a loved one in order for it to take place. For instance, an inverted version of this is in the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. In the fourth one, Blackbeard is looking to become immortal. So one of the ways in the story is that it requires the sacrifice of a blood relative. Now, in the case of Pirates of the Caribbean, it is used to show how evil Blackbeard is. But if we invert that and say, hey, I have an enemy that I am trying to find a way of defeating him, and you hint early on that there is a way, but the cost is too great. Say you have a family, your wife is, say, dead, and you only have a single child. By setting up a situation, and you've hinted this early on, that you have a spell, but by using the spell, it is going to cost the life of your child, you're going to try and find another way of doing it. But at the end, one of the things that you can do is to say, I couldn't find a way out of the situation, so at the climax, I am going to use this spell and it's going to cost my child their life. This is a cost that would be equivalent. When we are creating a cost, we need to also pay attention to how it's going to play out for the rest of the story. The closer to the end of the story, the more the cost can be ramped up. So in the situation where you have the bad guy that you're looking to overcome, it is totally conceivable that towards the end of the story, during the final battle, that you are sacrificing a loved one to win. We see a self-sacrifice all the time. In the movie Avengers Endgame, Tony sacrifices himself to defeat Thanos. But it's almost more tragic in a way if you have to sacrifice a child. One of those things that you see throughout all of history is the sacrifice of child for other people is always going to be more emotionally telling on the character. It's easy for us to understand self-sacrifice, but when you have to sacrifice a child for the sake of the world, this is truly heroic because it is so hard. Sanderson's third law of magic. Expand what you already have before you add something new. Often, the best storytelling happens when a thoughtful writer changes one or two things about what we know and then extrapolates purposely through all of the ramifications of that change. A brilliant magic system for a book is less often one with 1,000 different powers and abilities, and is more often a magic system with relatively few powers that the author has considered in depth. Extrapolating to me is about asking what happens when questions. What happens when the wizard converts to Christianity? What happens to warfare when a magic can create food out of thin air, enabling much more mobile armies? One of the other things that we can keep in mind is that when we are talking about expansion, we're talking about how do we have a set of rules and reach beyond it in ways that make sense. As always, we are trying to make sure that we are allowing for our magic systems to make sense. There's an anime called The Wrong Way to Use Healing Magic, where the main character only can use specific types of healing magic. What ends up happening is that the mentor of the main character has learned how to use healing magic to enhance the physical body. By using the healing magic almost as a steroid, being able to self-heal while working out creates a superhuman ability for running and fighting. Now, the main character isn't somebody who's looking to kill, but rather save people. And that's the whole focus of this particular story is not necessarily where the main character is brought in to overcome the enemy, but rather to save as many people as possible. And the way that they do this is that the main character goes through a grueling set of training regimens where they are learning how to use magic to enhance their own body. This is something that makes sense. So when we're talking about expanding, these are some of the ways that we can talk about it in our own stories. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. As always, I will be linking all the resources I use in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.